And welcome back. You're watching World Tonight here on TVP World. Now, today, the head of Poland's National Security Bureau, Jacek Siewiera, met with General Phillipe Lavigne, the NATO Supreme Allied Commander transformation in Warsaw.
Amongst other security issues, the officials are set to discuss Ukraine, hybrid threats from Belarus and Russia, and the upcoming NATO summit in Washington. To explore the significance of these talks, we're joined by Andrew Danieri. He's from the Eurasia Centre, the Atlantic Council. Welcome, sir, to TV World. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks very much for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure. So let's start with the meeting. In terms of countering the hybrid threat from the countries I've just mentioned, Russia and Belarus, what element of their conversation was centred on that?
Well, I think NATO, of course, realizes that Poland and some of these frontline Baltic states and now Finland, actually, with its border with Russia, are facing significant hybrid threats from Russia, including on these eastern borders. I think we heard earlier in the program that Poland is facing a record number of migrants trying to cross the eastern border there with Belarus. And in the past few years, we know that those have been weaponized by the Lukashenko regime there to essentially try to take people from other parts of the world, including the Middle East and Asia, and to essentially transport them to the Polish border to try to destabilize Poland. And the Russians are also doing this up in Finland, we know, and including elsewhere in the Baltics. So NATO will be well aware of that. And I think we saw the NATO officials seeing the Polish national security officials today to coordinate on exactly those issues, among others.
Now, Poland will spend a lot of money to secure the eastern flank. We're talking about the Eastern Shield, the border protection, European Sky Shield Initiative, etc. Now, do you think that NATO should get involved and help participate when it comes to financials and helping Poland to protect the flank?
It's certainly something that they should look at, including at the NATO summit here in Washington, because, as you mentioned there, the weaponization of migrants at these borders can be seen as, and probably should be seen as, a form of hybrid aggression, and in that way could now I think that's something that needs to be taken in coordination with, of course, all of the member states of NATO. And if this is something that Poland wants to get done quickly, could be better done from declarations from Warsaw itself, because for that fact that NATO requires much more coordination among allies.
Right. So we're staying on the financial issue. We all know that NATO countries are signed up to invest at least 2% of their GDP on defence, and Poland is leading the way with almost 4% at last count. But not all countries are spending even the 2%. What's going on there? What's stopping them? And surely they should be pulling their weight, shouldn't they?
Well, we saw some excellent news yesterday from Jens Stoltenberg, who's actually on a visit here in Washington, mentioning that 23 of the 32 now NATO countries are set to meet the 2% of GDP spending guideline, which is up from, it's a massive increase only from the past few years when Russia began its full-scale war against Ukraine. You rightly say that Poland is leading the way in terms of percent terms on GDP, and of course the United States is spending a great deal as well. But it really is encouraging to see other European countries wake up to the reality of Russian aggression and the idea that Russia is not our friend, they're not going to contribute to some peace dividend in Europe, and that states, not only the United States and its allies like Poland and like the Baltics on NATO's eastern flank, but other countries, including France and Germany in Central Europe and elsewhere in Western Europe, now understand that they do need to continue to invest in their own security and make sure that Europe can defend itself on its own 2 feet there.
Now, let me ask you about the issue of new Secretary General. Mark Rutte is the main candidate. He will probably become the Secretary General because, as we heard, he met with Viktor Orban, and Orban is no longer going to be an obstacle on his way to becoming the Secretary General. What is your take on Mark Rutte? Is he going to be a good Secretary General, do you think? What is his background, and what do you expect of him?
Well, Prime Minister Rutte has been a very strong diplomat, especially on the Ukraine, the Russian war against Ukraine over the past 2+ years. We saw him when he was here in Washington about a year ago, when he promised and was one of the first to talk about Patriot weapon systems to Ukraine. Now, that did take significant time to get to Ukraine, but I think it was a sign that under his leadership, the Netherlands was willing to be somewhat forward-leaning, but also to coordinate with allies. And I think when you look at a Secretary General and what NATO needs, it's a Secretary General that understands the Russian threat, understands the hybrid threats, not only from Russia, but from elsewhere in the world, and is willing to react and be decisive, and as well bring along other allies who might be a bit more cautious, including, unfortunately, our own leadership here in Washington. And so I do think that Prime Minister Rutte is a good candidate to be Secretary General, and ideally would bring a much more forward-leaning, forward-looking attitude to the alliance so that the alliance can more effectively counter the threats that the alliance and its neighbors face.
Indeed. So we expect continuity, which is always a good thing. But perhaps a firmer stance by Prime Minister Rutte. Now, there is a NATO summit coming up to be held in Washington shortly. What do you expect to be on the agenda there?
I think the main topic that'll be on everyone's lips is what to do about getting Ukraine into NATO. Now, the Biden administration, if we remember from last year at the Vilnius summit, was actually behind most NATO members and Washington's partners, and didn't want to extend a more, I would say, fast track to Ukraine. And that provoked some, I would say, some disconcerting conversations, not only with the U.S., but also with its allies. Now, I do expect at this summit, we will see Washington push forward its own, what it's calling a bridge to NATO for Ukraine, which is its attempt to kind of control the process a little more and to get Ukraine some concrete steps toward getting into the alliance, which I think is a positive. And I think no one really expects Ukraine, unfortunately, this year to be admitted into NATO, but it would behoove allies when they come to Washington to be forceful with the White House and to underscore the necessity of pushing Ukraine closer to NATO, which Ukraine desperately wants to join the alliance, and with an understanding that bringing Ukraine into the alliance would actually improve security and the alliance's capabilities.
Well, it's going to be a very interesting time when it comes to NATO summit, and we'll see if President Zelensky is going to be happier than after the previous NATO summit.
Right. Which was somewhat disappointing for him, but nonetheless, hopefully we're moving forward
that is
on that process.
Andrew Dinieri, Eurasia Center Atlantic Council, was our guest. Thank you, sir, very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.